Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Gigi Kopilak, and my guest today is Peter Stein. He is a professor of cinematography at the graduate program at NYU. He has an impressive list of movies, television, documentaries where he was the director of photography. It's an interesting story how he became a cinematographer, and it's also an interesting story about his family, particularly his father, who is Fred Stein. And Peter has published this beautiful legacy to his father, who was a photographer before and after the Second World War in Europe and America. I'm very happy to welcome Peter here. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for inviting me, Gigi.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So now that I have introduced your story about being a cinematographer, please, would you tell the story again? Because I love it.
Well, actually, I grew up in photography. My father was a still photographer, and we actually used to go out together and take pictures. So I learned photography as a young kid. He would take me into the darkroom, and very often we would compare our photographs. We'd walk around the streets of New York City and we'd see what he did and what I did. And
it's like when, can I just interrupt you?
Yeah.
My mother was an artist, and I would say to her, "You have a better brush." Was it something like that for your father? Or?
No, I mean, I didn't get criticized for my work.
No, I used to say she had the better brush.
Yeah, well, my father certainly had a better brush as a photographer.
A better eye, did you think?
Yeah, I mean, he taught me. He taught me composition. He taught me to appreciate lighting. He would take me to museums, and we would look at composition. You know, I'm a professor, and I talk to my students very often about composition and lighting and how you learn it. If you look in museums at pictures, at paintings,
right,
the artist has to think about the light and where it's coming from and what the shadows do and the quality of the light. Is it hard light? Is it soft light? What are the shadows, hard and soft? So those are all things that I learned as a young boy, and I teach my students that also. Okay.
So how did that transcribe? Because did you feel that you could have been a photographer then, like your father, or you felt that you couldn't?
I never wanted to be in competition with my father. In fact, the truth of the matter is, I never got into cinematography until after my father had passed away.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so I went to graduate school to be a sociologist.
Okay.
So it's a long way from that.
Well, this is the story I remember, that you weren't planning on being a cinematographer. You just sort of stepped into it.
Well, yeah, I got motivated. I really didn't know what I wanted to do in life, and but I'm good with people, and I started teaching in elementary school. It's a long time ago, and I was a good teacher, but I wasn't passionate about it. But then I made a small film in Super 8 at the time. Super 8 was
just
a big
on your
deal.
own.
On my own,
yeah,
with a couple of the kids in my class. It was in the South Bronx, and I loved it. I said, "Oh gosh, this is what I want to do."
Okay.
But I didn't know anybody in the film business, and I got very good reactions from my friends and the other teachers in the school. I showed it around, and it was a silent film, and I played it with music, and I would have to start the tape recorder and start the film at the same time. It was actually quite charming.
Yeah.
But it was a fun film, and so I didn't know anybody in the film business. I had no idea how to get into the film business or how I would learn. So I drove a cab for a year and a half. Well, I quit teaching.
Okay.
Drove a cab for a year and a half, and I finally, at the age of 27, I got a job as a messenger in a stock footage film company. They were doing a film on Khrushchev. Had written this book. It was for Time Life Films.
Okay.
And he'd written a autobiography, and it was called Khrushchev Remembers. And so I would go around to different labs, picking up stock footage and bringing it back. And then I worked my way up in that company, and soon became an apprentice editor, and then the production manager, which is, but then I heard about a film that they were looking for a boom man.
Okay.
Somebody who holds the microphone.
Right.
So I jumped at that, but I also started working as an assistant cameraman, and 3 years after I was a messenger, I became a director of photography.
It's amazing.
Which was a very quick rise.
Yes, absolutely.
But it was because of the training that I got from my father. And I mean, when I was in high school, I had won a Kodak photography contest, a national photography contest. So I took a lot of pictures when I was a kid, and so that's why I was.
So they recognized that you had the composition, you could frame a picture, and
Well, as a cinematographer, when I was working as an assistant, and I met a young man who was making a film, and he was looking for a DP. It's called director of photography, and I said, "Well, that's what I want to do." And he was looking for someone who he didn't have to pay. And I was looking for anybody who would hire me for no money. I didn't care, just to work and to practice. So I did a film with him, and it won many awards. And at the same time that I did this narrative film with him, it was about Charles Ives, the American composer. The same time that I did that, I also got a job working on a documentary about horses, which was very interesting for me. Having grown up in Manhattan, I knew nothing about horses.
So you're learning as you go.
That's part of the film business, yeah.
But some of the movies that you've done, we recognize, like for instance, Pet Sematary. You worked with Stephen King to do Pet Sematary?
Yes. Well, Pet Sematary, that's actually probably the most well-known of the movies that I've shot. Pet Sematary was interesting. I was working on a movie, an Ernest movie. Ernest, the first Ernest movie was Ernest Goes to Camp, which I did not shoot, but I shot the second one, Ernest Saves Christmas. And I got a call from my agent, said they would like to, they're going to fire the director of photography on this film, and they'd like you to take over. And
is that how it happens? So that they just choose you, don't audition, or you don't show your work, or
usually you do show your work, and they interview a lot of people. But they were going to let this guy go, and so honestly, I'd heard of Stephen King, but I didn't really know his work. And so my agent said, and as a director of photography, you're sort of responsible for your crew for getting more work. I needed to work, but I needed to bring my crew with me, because if you're working with a crew who you know and are comfortable with, and they know your style, and so it's much better than to hire a new crew each film you do. If you go from one film to the next film to the next film, everybody works together, and things move very quickly, because in film, the faster you work, the more you get hired, because
they got a budget to catch.
So expensive. If you're slow, that's the death knell for a director of photography. Is to be known as slow. They want someone who's fast and good. So I got this call. They want to replace their director of photography, and would you take over? And I said yes. It would be perfect. I'd go from one film to the next. And I said, just send the script to my house. I'll be home next week. We're just ending this film. And I had to be in Maine, where we were shooting in like 2 days after I got home. So I had shot this other film before, which was a horror film. It was Friday the 13th, Part 2. It was the largest grossing film, second largest grossing film for Paramount in 1981, and I hated it. Horror films scare me. I don't go to them. I don't like anything about them. So I shot Friday the 13th 2. Actually, I worked on Part 1 also. And I swore I was never going to shoot another horror film. I didn't want to be known as a horror film DP. I didn't like them particularly for what they said, and so I didn't know too much about Stephen King. I got up to May.
You didn't know it was a horror film?
I didn't know it was a horror film, and in fact, some people say it's not, and that's part of Well, so I got home and the script wasn't there.
Oh.
So I get to Maine, and they had a script for me, and I'm reading it from the airport to the house that they had rented for me.
Right.
And I said, "Oh my God, this is a horror film!" and not only was it a horror film, it was a horror film about a 2-year-old who dies. He gets run over by a truck,
Oh,
and
gosh.
his father is so upset he buries him in the cemetery, and he comes back to life, and he kills his parents. And I mean, it was like, but it was really well written, and it was, I mean, it was Stephen King. It was really good.
Yeah.
So, and I had a 2-year-old at the time.
Oh my
and
gosh.
I'm reading it, and I said, "Oh God, I can't do this film. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to get there." I hadn't even gotten to the set yet to meet the director and the producer. And so the first thing I do, I get home and to the house that they had rented for me, and I called my agent and I said, "I don't want to do this film." And he said, "Well, didn't you read the script?" And I said, "I just read it." And he said, "Oh, they didn't send it to you?" I said, "No." So he said, "Well, listen, they didn't send you the script, so just tell them they, you know,
Right.
and stay there until they can find someone, because this is going to cost them a lot of money." Okay. So I said, yeah, I would do that. And as soon as I met the producer and director, I said, "Nice to meet you. I can't do the film. It's a horror film, and I'm not shooting horror films." But they were so nice. They didn't freak out. They didn't say, "Oh, you'll never work in Hollywood again. You'll never, you know, how can you do this?" They said, "Oh, we understand, you know." So I worked on the film, and they were bringing in other cinematographers, interviewing them while I was shooting this first week. And Fred Gwynn, who's you know, the big tall guy, he played Lurch on the Addams Family and Car 54. And he said to me, he said, "Peter, I'm not going to let you leave." He said, "You know, this is working so well. You're so good. We really like you." And he said, "I want you to know, this is not a horror film."
Okay.
He said, "I lost a child. I wouldn't be working on this film if it was a horror film." And I said, "Whoa."
Wow.
So, and then they had got me this house about 100 feet from the ocean, a big old Victorian, big old Victorian house, and they were paying me a lot of money. And the people were so nice, so I did it.
You did it.
I did it, and it turns out to be the most well-known of the films I did.
Right.
You know, in fact, and part of the reason for that is I never moved to California. To Los Angeles. I didn't want to raise my family in Los Angeles.
Okay.
I didn't. New York now. I wanted to live in New York. I like the seasons. I like the fauna and the flora. I like winter. I like summer. I like all the seasons. California, every time I met somebody in California in the film business, or a lot of them were from New York, and they all said, "Oh, I love New York. I want to come back to New York." So I didn't move to California, which would have been very good for my career. In fact, on 3 separate occasions, my wife and I said, "We're going to move to California," and we always backed down. Yeah. Now there's a lot of film work in New York. But there wasn't in those days quite, you know, like it is now. So you had to be in California if you wanted to meet the people, the producers and directors. You'd meet them at parties, and you'd be hired. So having an agent, for instance, there were just, you know, maybe 75, 80% of the films were already, somebody needed a director of photography, they would hire someone who they met at a party, or who you know, they knew their work or something. So I got work, but they weren't the biggest films.
But still, you have an impressive list. I mean, you have a website, and you look up. Oh no, I think I saw everything on IMBD.
Yes,
right.
IMBD.com is the big film website. Oh yeah, I've shot over 50 movies.
50. Wow.
Yeah, but you know, they weren't the biggest films. I mean, they were sort of moderate films, and I'm very happy. But you know, with my career, and I would do it exactly the same way again. But if I know, and I knew at the time, if I wanted to do the biggest of the big films, for instance, here's an example. I worked on actually the first Ernest film I did. Ernest
Goes to Camp? Or
no, it was Ernest Saves Christmas.
Oh, Ernest
was the name of it.
Right.
Okay, so the producer of that film was friends with Francis Ford Coppola. He had worked on the film about Vietnam.
Oh yeah, I know it too, but I can't think of it.
I'm just blanking now.
Okay.
But I'll think of it in a second.
It'll come
Apocalypse Now.
Okay.
So he had worked on Apocalypse Now, and he said to me, "Do you know Francis?" And I said, "No, I don't know him." He said, "Oh, well, I'm going to have to introduce you to him. You know, your work is so great. You know, maybe you guys can work together." And his children and my children played together.
Okay.
On the set. We were shooting in Orlando. And so he had children the same age as mine. If I lived in California, we would have socialized together.
Right.
I would have met Francis, you know, you never know the serendipity of how you get movies and so on. But you know, that film was over. The Ernest film I was shooting was over. I've never seen him again since I shot. So that's why, you know, I tell my students now, if it's a lot of the film business is who you know, and just make sure you stay friends, and when you meet people, stay in contact with them.
Right, right. I think that's true. Networking is important everywhere you go, but especially, I guess, the film business.
Yeah.
This is so interesting. I'd love to talk about all of your films, but I want to get on to your history, the story of your family, because I think that's another interesting story. And your family was born in Germany?
Yeah, both my parents were born in Dresden, Germany. My father was born in 1909, and my mother was born the year after. And my father was a brilliant person, a true intellectual, and he was very active in politics. He was a socialist, which was very anti-communist. In this country, a lot of times people think of socialists as being communists. He wasn't at all, and in fact, he was one of the people who warned others about Stalin and how bad communism was. But he was also a very big anti-fascist and against the Nazis. In fact, as a young man, he would ride around on his bicycle handing out literature against the fascists and giving lectures and so on. Mm-hmm. And then he went to school to be a public defender. He wanted to help the downtrodden and the poor people. So he was very concerned, and he was a real humanitarian. In fact, he went to see Hitler speak once, and he told me he was like this far away from Hitler, who was walking up and down the aisles in this beer hall, because he wanted to see what Hitler was about. And after that, he said he really believed him, that when he
believed Hitler.
He believed that if Hitler ever came to power, he would do what he said he wanted to do. So
but he lied, but Hitler was lying.
Well, what he said he wanted to do was do away with the Jews. So people didn't believe that he really meant it.
Oh, I see what you mean.
So Fred warned people, and he was very adamant about trying to stop him from being elected. And Hitler was elected into office. I mean, it was crazy.
Crazy.
Yeah. So so my father went to law school to become a public defender. And the year that I should say, in order to practice law in Germany in those days, and it may still be possible today, this may be true today, in order to practice law and go to court, you had to work for the government as like an intern in the public prosecutor's office. So it was a government job, but you had to do that for 2 years. So the year that Fred, my father, graduated from law school, he graduated first in his class, so he was really smart, from Leipzig University. That year was the year that Hitler was elected into office.
Wow.
And the first law he passed was that Jews couldn't work for the government. So Fred, who was this brilliant lawyer to be, couldn't work for the government, couldn't be an intern, he would never be certified to work in court. So he couldn't do that. He got a job working for a friend of his whose father owned a factory, and he became the law consultant. So he could look up cases so that the lawyer, in the libraries and so on, and get precedent and so on, and draw up briefs. but the lawyers for the company would have to go to court, present them. So he could never be in court. Meanwhile, he was still very active against the fascists. And one day, the Gestapo came to the owner of the factory asking questions about him.
Oh.
And so the owner spoke to his son and said, "Tell Fred Stein he better get out of Germany."
Oh.
So he and my mother, who had just gotten married, they left a week later on the pretense of going on a honeymoon to France.
Okay.
But they left. They told their parents they were gone. And but for their wedding, they had gotten each other a Leica camera as a wedding gift, because photography was his big hobby, and she was interested in photography also. So they went to France. They never came back.
But she left behind a real mansion.
Well, my mother came from a very wealthy family, and so in fact, this is in Dresden, which was during the war. It was firebombed, but this was my mother's grandmother's house. It was called the Villa Salzburg. Salzburg was my mother's maiden name. And that house, her grandmother's house, which was a few blocks away from her house, which was in a very fancy neighborhood in Dresden, that house was the first house that the Nazis took over and made their headquarters. And it's still standing today, and the reason is the Nazis moved out of that house. It was too small for them for their headquarters. They built a new headquarters, but they gave that house to the Red Cross.
Okay.
And the Red Cross, during the bombing, there were people in the house, and they were on the roof with buckets of water putting out the fires.
Interesting.
So that house is still standing, and it's just been renovated. And it's a beautiful house. Of course, the gardens aren't there anymore, the tennis court, the stables, all.
So there's a lot of property.
There was a lot of property. And when the Soviets, because Dresden was in the eastern part of Germany. So when Germany was divided, the East Zone and the West, the Soviets put up apartment buildings on the property. And in fact, this house was really beautiful. It had wooden ceilings and paneling, and it was and the Soviets were very much against finery and art and so on. It wasn't like for the people, so they plastered over everything, and it was pretty junky. But now it's been renovated, and it's quite beautiful. Yeah.
So, okay, so your mother and your father go to Paris, and they both have the Leica camera. Now, the Leica camera, you put around your, and you look down.
Yeah, it's a small 35 millimeter camera. The Leica really revolutionized photography. Before the 35 millimeter camera, there were these big cameras, wooden cameras and tripods, and well, the Leica camera together with fast film. So the Leica was, what you had to do before is people would have to stop and they'd have to pose and they couldn't move, and you could take pictures in the street, but first of all you had to carry this heavy thing and put it up, and a lot of any kind of movement very often would be fuzzy and soft because of the movement.
Right.
Well, with the Leica you could take pictures unobtrusively and quickly.
Right. As you're talking, I'm hoping we can show some of the pictures from Paris.
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
Because I think that it's interesting that he got such amazing candid shots, and you're just saying that you could with this.
You could, because first of all, with the Leica, you could just roll it, click, roll it, click. You didn't have to pull out a plate, and the film was fast, the lenses were fast, and you know, people didn't necessarily even know you were taking a picture.
Right.
You could just walk up and boop, take their picture.
You didn't have to do this, though, did you? You could hold it down here, couldn't you?
Well, mainly you would hold it here, because that's where the viewfinder was.
Oh, there wasn't a way that you could look down? And
no,
look
that's in New York, he used a Rolleiflex, and the Rolleiflex, you would look down.
Oh, okay.
So it's interesting, in New York and Paris, the viewpoint very often is a different, you know, it's this versus the lens was much lower in New York.
Okay.
But the interesting thing about my father's photography is that he was an outsider. He was an outsider when he went to Paris, and he was an outsider in New York. And Paris was quite different from Germany. Germany was much more formal and very much into framing and more formal kind. Paris, just the lifestyle was free and easy, so it must have been fascinating. I mean, my parents were young; they were in their early 20s.
And your mother was helping him, was she?
She worked as a as his assistant.
Okay.
Well, first of all, they had to decide. They didn't know what they were going to do to support themselves.
Okay.
They had a little bit of wedding money that they had gotten. But he couldn't be a lawyer in Paris because, first of all, there was a law in France that in order to practice law, you had to live there for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And the second thing is he couldn't get a job because they wouldn't allow foreigners to get jobs. The only jobs that a foreigner could get or an immigrant could get was an artist or a journalist.
Okay.
That kind. So that's what a lot. I mean, because people would come. Paris was the center of all these refugees coming from all over Europe, from all these countries that Germany had invaded. So there were or going to invade the people. So there were Hungarians and Poles and Germans and Czechoslovaks and Austrians and anywhere where people were afraid of the Nazis, especially Jews, but intellectuals and anti-fascists, they came to Paris. And it was an amazing thing that they allowed all these immigrants to come in. America didn't allow immigrants in, especially Jews. So they were in Paris. It must have been a great time, given that everybody was afraid that the Nazis were going to take over the world.
Right. So does he get a job as a journalist then, taking photography? Or?
Well, he and my mother decided they needed a profession that was an international profession. God forbid that the Nazis would come into Paris and they would have to escape again, which they eventually did. He didn't want to start all over again. So his hobby was photography. He was allowed to work as a photographer, so he learned photography. He studied it. He read books. He met people. Now, the one thing my parents had in Paris when they got there was they were still involved politically against Hitler. So they were in these socialist groups. So he met many people through these socialist groups, including photographers who eventually taught him photography. Very famous photographer, Philippe Halsman, taught him a lot of photography. But he met people like André Malraux, who later became the cultural minister in France. And Willy Brandt, who became the chancellor of Germany, he wasn't there, but he was actually, Willy Brandt was living in Norway. And he was trying to organize an underground against Hitler. He had escaped to Norway. And he was trying to organize an underground against Hitler in Germany. And he would sneak in from Norway. He'd go through France into Germany. And every time he came to France, he would stay with my parents. So after he became the mayor of Berlin when the wall was built, and he and Kennedy made that speech, I'm a Berliner. So when my parents always maintained contact with Willy Brandt. So they knew him when he was just a young boy. In fact, he was younger than my parents. My mother was in love with him. She told me, "Oh, he was so handsome."
So he becomes a photographer and as a freelance, sells his images to.
Those were the days when magazine photography, like Life magazine in the United States, magazine photography and doing photo stories was a big thing. So there were a lot of these immigrants in Paris, like Robert Capa and his girlfriend Gerda Taro. They were doing pictures of Spanish Civil War for magazines, and so they would go out on assignment. My father did that also.
Was Robert Capa. There was a group, Henry Cartier-Bresson.
Yes,
and
Magnum is the group they started years later when he came to the United States.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but Fred was working in Paris. In fact, the way they started is they used to go and take pictures of monuments and just scenes of Paris, and they'd make postcards and sell them in the street to tourists. And then they would go to demonstrations. There were always demonstrations against against the fascists, and he would take pictures of the people speaking in the demonstration, and then go to the next one and sell postcards of these famous people who were talking. And eventually he became a fairly, he started doing pretty well. He had pictures published in England, and there were articles written about him and his work, and so he was doing pretty well until...
And he always had this amazing ability with the abstract shapes, this dark and light. I think that's what strikes me about all of his work.
Well, especially in New York. But he was educated in art. He loved art, and when he was in high school in Germany, in fact, his mother in Germany had gotten him a subscription so that he could go to any of the museums in Dresden. And Dresden was a city renowned for its museums, and there were 15 major museums in the city that wasn't quite that big. So he was very much into art. But his main thing in Paris was, because he was an outsider, and this holds true in New York also when he came to New York, because he was an outsider, he was just fascinated by everything. He would go to walking around, going through all the different areas of Paris, taking pictures of the poor people, taking pictures of rich people, taking pictures of artists, and going into the Jewish sections in the Marais district in Paris. And very often you see the subject of his picture, one of them or relating to the photographer. And he was a humanitarian, so he wasn't threatening.
Right. But there's one picture of his pregnant flower.
Cellar, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's filled with pathos, and just, you really feel it. And for him to be just taking it like that, it was amazing. It's amazing to me that he caught that emotion. And
you know what he did, since he was a humanitarian, he wasn't looking down on his subject, like, oh, look at you, you poor little child in the slums of Paris, or you flower seller in Paris, trying to make money, and she's pregnant and she's holding a baby.
Yeah.
He had just a beautiful rapport with people. He wasn't threatening, and he wasn't condescending. He was he had humanity, and he felt for people, and they reacted that way.
Yeah.
I very often say, I just couldn't do that. I couldn't, in New
yeah.
York, when I was a kid, and now especially, I mean, I couldn't just go up to people and take their picture.
I don't know if you could do it now. I wonder.
I don't know if I could have done it then. It's like, especially.
But maybe photography was new to these people at that point.
I'm sure that's a good part of it. It wasn't quite as, today you almost feel like the Native Americans had a feeling when Edward S. Curtis had to become friends with them before he could take their picture, because it was stealing their soul. Or I couldn't go up to someone in Brooklyn or Manhattan or anywhere and just take their picture, because they would be insulted or could get angry. It's like, or what's your problem?
Exactly.
So, but Fred was he was an outsider. He was fascinated by it all, by the architecture, by the people, by what they were doing.
And there's one with two little girls on a swing. I can't imagine how many images he would have taken before he got just that perfect diagonal of the two of them together.
Well, I got to tell you, I've looked through the contact sheets.
Okay.
He did not take many pictures.
Really?
You look at, especially today with the automatic cameras, you just like the motorized cameras, you'd take 100 pictures.
Well, I know a friend of mine, she just keeps it there, and she took 4,000 pictures walking around Africa.
Yeah, right, exactly. And my parents never had any money.
Okay.
So film was an expense for him, and he would take very few pictures. And it kills me sometimes that there's a fabulous picture, but it wasn't sharp because he just picked it up and why didn't he take another one? Why aren't there 5 or 6 of that? Because it's a great scene, but he was amazing because he would capture that perfect moment in so few images and so few chances. He was really
Yeah,
very good.
that is
Very
amazing.
good.
Yeah.
And you know, one of the things that he did is he would work very quickly, and then so he just picked the camera up and shoot. He always had the camera with him, so he was always wearing a camera. And then in the darkroom, he would compose it the way he liked. So he didn't set it up and figure it, you know. I mean, sometimes he did, but in certain situations, he would just pick it up and shoot it. But he would find the right angle, shoot it. So
he was making his own film afterwards too. He was in the darkroom.
He was in the darkroom and composing.
Okay.
Some photographers feel that the full frame is their art. So that's one way of looking at photography. That this is the picture I take. The whole frame is my art. Fred took the picture and knew in his head how he was going to compose it later, but he didn't want to lose that moment by you know, just getting exactly the right spot and getting it just right, and then you lose it.
So he would play with it afterwards.
So that was his method.
So now
of
what
photography.
happens now? They're in Paris. He's doing well.
So they're in Paris, and it looks like Germany's going to invade France, and so the French decide they're going to put, just very similar to what happened in the United States, with putting all the Japanese people of Japanese descent into detention camps. The French did the same thing. They put everybody with a German passport into detention camps. They called them concentration camps, but they weren't the concentration camps like we think of. All over France, they put them in these camps. So my sister was born in France, so she was a French citizen. So the French wouldn't put the mother of a French citizen. The French have a very elevated view of women. So they wouldn't put the mother of a French citizen into a detention camp, but the father, he went. So he was put in a detention camp north of Paris, and those camps were really very horrible. A lot of people died, especially older people and children. The one that my father was in had wooden bleachers, concrete bleachers. That's where you slept in the rain and whatever. And
outside?
Outside.
Wow.
And so there was dysentery, there were diseases. It was terrible. Although they weren't doing what the Germans did, it was still horrible. But what the French didn't do is they didn't think, okay, the Nazis are invading. Who are they going to kill first? The Jews.
Right.
So they put the Jews in these camps, they put Nazis in the camps, they put communists in the camps, they put people who were not political in the camps. Anybody who had anything to do with Germany went into these camps, which was completely crazy. So when the Nazis finally did invade, now meanwhile my mother's in Paris, my father's in this camp, they confiscated his camera, he organized a library in the camp and so on. You know, they tried to make do the best they could. The Nazis are invading, and what's going to happen is when they reach the camps, they were going to send the Jews to Auschwitz. They were going to liberate the Nazis. Right. You know, it was very dangerous. And he managed to escape with a few friends, and he walked to Toulouse, which is sort of halfway in. At that time, after the Germans invaded, they split France in two. There was the so-called Free France, which was Vichy France, and Marshal Pétain was the head of that, and it was a puppet government under the thumb of Hitler. Right. And then there was the occupied zone, Paris. So my father is now in Toulouse. He walks hiding in chicken coops and in the fields and keeping off the roads where the
by himself, or he's with these other people?
He's with these other people, and finally they all decided it'd be safer if they all split up. So he's by himself. He makes it to Toulouse. He stays at a friend's house who was actually the mayor of Toulouse, who was in the same political party as Fred. And he sends a postcard to my mother in Paris. He sends a lot of postcards, hoping that one of them is going to get through. And he says my parents had pseudonyms which they used because even when they were in Paris, when they went to political meetings, they didn't use their own names. So because those were dangerous times. Right. So his pseudonym was Fritz Berger, And he said, he just sent a card and said, Fritzberger is at this and this address. And that was it. So my mother knew he was alive. So she left the next day. And so people were trying to get out of the occupied zone,
Right.
where the Nazis were in control, to the free France, where the puppet government was in control, but at least they weren't the Nazis directly. They were right-wing fascist French.
Okay.
So there were thousands of people trying to get out. And she's in line trying to get out. And she's got my sister, who's a year and a half old. She's got a valise, a suitcase filled with clothing. She's got another suitcase filled with his negatives and prints.
Oh, she thought to bring them.
She believed in my father. She knew he was a great artist.
Right.
And she had my sister's potty over her shoulder. Because my sister was toilet training. She was a mother. She didn't want her to regress
Right.
in her upbringing. So she's loaded down with this baby and so on. My mother was fairly attractive. So there's this lines, blocks and blocks long, and thousands of people trying to get out. And there's a gendarme marching up and down the line trying to keep order. And there's a lot of police there. And my mother smiles at him. And he says, "Oh, madame, can I help you?"
Oh.
And she says, "I'm trying to reach my husband in Toulouse. He was just demobilized, as if he had been in the French army, because they had surrendered." And
she spoke French.
And she spoke French fluently. You couldn't tell that either of my parents spoke French fluently. They both could pass. When they came to the United States, they had thick German accents, but in France they could speak French without an accent. So he says, "Oh, madame, let me help you." And he takes her and brings her to the front of the line to this Nazi officer and says, "This woman needs to go to see her husband and give her a pass." And so she got a pass, and she got out and met my father in Toulouse, and then they made their way to Marseille. And through the efforts of Varian Fry and the Emergency Rescue Committee, which was an amazing organization, and I know we don't have time to talk about him right now, but
he saved many people.
He saved many. He saved over 2,000 people like Chagall and anybody who was on the list to be arrested by the Nazis. He was trying to get out, and he managed to get a lot of people out, including my parents. And so 1941, they left France and they came to the United States.
Wow. And did they stay in New York?
They stayed in New York. I should say...
So the pictures of the New York...
Pictures, and he was, by the way, he wasn't only taking pictures of street scenes, he was taking pictures of people also. So he met many famous people in France, and same in New York. So he took street scenes in New York as well as portraits of people. So eventually in New York, he started having problems with his mobility, and he stopped taking street scenes, but he always took
But meanwhile, he took
portraits.
some of these, the one on the cover, which is Little Italy.
Yes.
Which I love.
Yeah, it's these 5 Italian women. I think he took that in, I believe the year was 1943, when Italy surrendered, and he walked the streets. I mean, he was fascinated by New York. New York was completely different from Paris. New York was free and exciting and strong, and the buildings were tall, and there's all sorts of stark. Each of the 2 cities had their own personality, and so he was capturing that on film also.
Right. Yes, he has quite a few pictures of the buildings, which is great. But then you said Italy surrenders. He has that one picture of the family looking at the magazine, at the newspaper of Italy surrenders and the little kids in the carriage. And I just, you really feel he didn't pose anyone. You felt that.
Yeah, he didn't pose people. He didn't pose people. Because there's one picture that's posed, which is, and he tried it once, and it's a really beautiful picture. It's this little picture here. It's called Dobbs Fifth Avenue. It was a commercial for Dobbs hats.
Oh, okay.
And so there's a model there. So she's posed, but that's the only picture I know that's posed.
Okay.
He just captured pictures of people in their natural habitats.
Yeah, no, and the little girl in the car, I think that's adorable. I love that one.
That picture was taken in Harlem, and you could see in that picture the little girl relating to him, and it's like, you know, somebody coming up to take her picture.
Yeah.
You know,
She doesn't look afraid.
She's
Or
not afraid, and
yeah.
he's, you know, he really photographed people with love, and he really loved people.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's why I say he was a humanitarian. He didn't. He didn't. Yeah, he was an outsider. That's the best way to view him. He was fascinated by New York, and he ended up.
But when you say he's an outsider, you know, he must have felt, though, some kind of sympathy with the people. But, I mean,
he was an outsider for the culture, sure. But he was an
so he was
insider.
curious about everything.
He was curious
about everything.
But as a human being, he had a real simpatico with people.
Okay.
And I mean, eventually he became an American through and through, and was more red, white, and blue than you could imagine.
Yeah.
You know.
I don't know if we have the picture of him with the city with the great big the L.
The L with that shape of the architecture of New York was fascinated him because it was so different. The difference between France and Germany, you know, there is a difference in the architecture.
Oh, absolutely.
But not as great a difference as there is between New York and the rest of Europe, especially in the 40s. Right. I mean, New York with the skyscrapers and that must have been, for someone who had an eye for art and the Bauhaus art that he liked. I mean, he photographed people like, well, the founder of the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, and Le Corbusier, the famous architect.
Well, now you're talking about the portraits. Before we get to looking at all of those, we'll talk about Albert Einstein, because that's one of his most famous pictures, isn't it?
Albert Einstein is probably his most famous picture. You know, what's happening today is people are starting to learn Fred Stein's name and his work. But everybody knows that picture of Albert Einstein. And people often ask me, how did he come to photograph Einstein? How did he come to photograph all these famous people? He took over 1,200 portraits of personalities, which is a huge, huge number. And how did he get to these people? Well, he never worked for any magazines or anybody. He worked for himself. And he was an intellectual, and he loved to meet people and talk to them on their level, not necessarily on their level. Like with Einstein, he couldn't talk physics with him, but he could talk politics, he could talk philosophy. My father read all the time. He would read the New York Times every day from cover to cover. He would read 2 or 3 magazines a week, Time magazine, Fortune, you know, Life, but and then he read books. He read 2 or 3 books a week. So he was always reading, and he would remember everything. And he would have an opinion on everything or on a lot of things, and they were considered opinions. So he got to Einstein through Einstein's first assistant. Einstein had a few assistants who worked with him at Princeton. And his first assistant had gone to high school with Fred. Oh. And so he asked Einstein if it would be all right if Fred took his picture. Einstein hated having his picture taken. But he knew for a refugee, it would be important for him, for his career. And so he wanted to help Fred. So he gave him a 10-minute appointment. And Fred came to Princeton and took his picture. And they had such a great time together. And so after 10 minutes, Einstein's secretary came in and said, "Oh, you have to leave. The professor has work to do." And Einstein would say, no, he has to stay. He has to stay. So they ended up staying for 2 hours. He had 2 hours to be with Einstein. And you know, one of the things he said is that for part of the time, they had such a great time, they were telling each other dirty jokes in German.
That's funny.
You know, Einstein was, I guess, starved for someone to talk German to.
Right, yeah. But and to tell dirty jokes.
To tell dirty jokes. I mean, how many people can you tell? Because you're Einstein, you don't do that.
Right.
But I noticed, I looked at my father's contact sheets, and there's that famous picture, but the rest of the pictures he took were really good. But there's only 24 of them. In 2 hours, he took 24 pictures. Well, today with the motorized camera, you know, somebody would take a few hundred,
few hundred.
1,000 pictures in 2 hours,
2 hours
with Einstein. Took 24 pictures. He was, number one, he didn't want to spend the money for, my father never made a lot of money. He really didn't make money. Every once in a while, somebody will call me up and say, you know, they'll see an exhibition or something on the internet, and they'll say, your father took pictures of my bar mitzvah or my wedding.
Oh,
and
no kidding.
Fred hated to take pictures of you know,
Right.
that he got paid for,
Right.
like weddings and so on. But he would do it for friends. A friend of his, their son was getting married and so on. And so he would make some money doing that, but he really hated that.
But how did the picture of Einstein become so ubiquitous?
You know, I have no idea,
Oh.
but it just captures his soul.
It does. It's beautiful.
And publishers
Well, where
and
would
newspapers.
people have gotten it?
Well, publishers got it.
Okay.
You know, that was one of the things. He would take pictures of people and he would give them a gift. Here's a picture. Give it to your publisher. Give it to the newspapers.
Okay.
But there's a stamp on the back. If it's used, it's copyright Fred Stein. If they use it, they have to pay. So the press got hold of that picture, and it captured Einstein, the pathos in his eyes and who he was, and it just caught on, and it was used. It's been used all over in magazines and newspapers and books and so on. So
But his name never became.
my father's name, people say, oh, I know that picture, but I have no idea who took it.
Right.
Now people are starting to recognize the
That's
pictures.
what you're
Now there
doing,
are some other iconic pictures for that people know, you know.
I feel like the Salvatore Dali was an iconic picture.
Dali, there's an interesting story with Dali. My father was taking his picture. My father used to bring a journal or something with him, and when he was with someone famous, he'd ask them to write a little something, and Dali did a little doodle and so on. And Fred said to him, you know, let me ask you a question. How do you get your mustache to stay like that? And he said, oh, I use sugar water. And he said, there's one of the benefits of having sugar water is that flies come and land on it. Which is perfect for Dali. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then you have a picture of Georgia. He had a picture of Georgia O'Keeffe.
Yeah, Georgia O'Keeffe is.
Was she in New York?
It's a great picture. No,
Yeah.
she was in Abiquiu, New Mexico.
Yeah. So
And my parents were on vacation, and they were taking a trip across country by car. And they actually, this is interesting because Georgia O'Keeffe, she must have been in her 80s or late 70s when that picture was taken. I think 80s. But she liked men a lot. She had this young man who was living with her, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, we should all have.
She was really cool. She was
very
really cool.
cool.
I mean, she had been married to the great photographer Stieglitz
right.
when she was younger, and he was much older than she was.
And he took fabulous pictures of her.
He took great pictures of her. So she was partial to photographers. And so my father made an appointment, and what he very often did when he wanted to meet someone, he would use that Einstein picture as in fact, he had it on his business card, and he would use that as a calling card. He'd say, oh, you took that picture? Yes. So I don't know how he got to Georgia O'Keeffe, but she agreed to let him come and take her picture. But she was into men, as I say. And so when my mother and father show up at their appointed time, he comes in with his camera. Now, my mother was a college professor in the United States. She taught high school, and, but she eventually became a college professor. But she also worked as his assistant in France, and she always spotted pictures, and she was a helper and believer in his work. So she comes in to help him. I mean, I can imagine her carrying a bag or something like that. And Georgia O'Keeffe says, okay, says to my mother, she says, okay, you can wait outside. She wanted to be alone with him. I mean, can you imagine that?
No.
That's
a great story.
Yeah.
I love it, actually, that she would do that.
Yeah, she was a character.
Yeah. So, well, I wish you so much luck. I think this book is available at the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville.
Yeah, he's going to be carrying, or he is carrying it.
Yeah.
Fred Stein, it's called Fred Stein, Paris, New York.
Right. And
Yeah, it was
You can get it on Amazon.
just released. Yeah,
Yeah,
you can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
Right,
You
and
know.
it's really a fabulous, fabulous book.
And the website is fredstein.com.
Right.
And there's a lot of pictures that aren't in the book, and there's a lot of pictures in the book that aren't on the website.
Oh, okay.
So we're very excited about this. There was a huge exhibition of his work in Berlin.
Yeah, because this is half German in this book.
Yeah, the book is published. It's in German and English.
Okay.
In fact, the German is so light. It's
yeah,
really hard. It's really hard to see the German.
No, I know.
But,
but it's great because you can read the English very well.
Yeah, the English is perfect. Yes.
Yeah.
But it was a big exhibition, and so now there are exhibitions all over in galleries that carry his work.
Do you think there's going to be a show soon that you can tell us about, or do you know of any?
Well, I'm working on a big show in Paris.
Okay.
But I can't tell you about it because nothing's been signed, and I don't want to jinx it.
But we can find out on the website. We can go to fredstein.com, and the information will be there.
Well, when it's in inked. And there might be another book. I don't even know about that. So, and then we're hoping for an exhibition at the International Center of Photography in New York.
Oh.
So there was one at the ICP, the International Center of Photography, in 1995. There was a small exhibition of his New York pictures, but we're hoping for a big one-man show there.
Right. And didn't Jacob Burns?
Jacob Burns Foundation. The Jacob Burns Foundation gave us a small grant. Barry Schenkman there, the president, really helped us out a number of years ago. I'm working on a film about my father and really my life or my journey to bring his work to prominence. He was forgotten. Fred Stein was forgotten because he died so young. He died in 1967 at the age of 58. And photography really took off as an art form in the late 70s and 80s. So a lot of his contemporaries of the level that he was at are very well known now. And it's really through my efforts that his work is becoming popular.
So, and you've been working on this film for many years.
I've been working on the film for about 5 years. And so
Any clue to the light at the end of the tunnel, or is it?
My wife is a film editor and my daughter's a film editor. So we're doing this as an in-house project, buying stock footage. The film is made up of stock footage of the day, interviews with a lot of people, and of course the photographs. And so we're talking to historians at Princeton and NYU and Columbia and.
That's amazing.
So we're talking about their interviews of the history of what was happening, as well as photo curators and so on. So it's what happened. So what happened in the day, as well as what's happening in photography. Okay. So I've been bringing his work back.
Well, we'll look forward to that. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm really glad to share this with you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for watching.